ACF was like the only real popular Polyglot tool manager. I took a closer look at it a couple of years ago, and I realized that it was terribly slow. It was making my shell take 2 seconds to load. I bet if I rewrote this in another language, I could make it faster.
Hello, welcome to devtools-fm. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey everyone, we're really excited to have Jeff Dickey on with us. Jeff, you are the author of my new favorite tool, a tool that I'm using in literally all of my projects. I'm like going back and resurrecting projects just so I can add this tool, which is a fun side quest. But so you're the author of Mise, which is a tool version manager, and we're really excited to talk about that today. But before we dive into that, would you like to tell our audience a little bit more about yourself?
You bet. Yeah. So I've kind of been in the developer productivity space for about a decade. And so my first job was I joined Heroku to rewrite the CLI. Basically had a mandate that the old Ruby Heroku CLI needed to go. So I've been doing DevTools for a long time. I started at Heroku where I came on with a mandate to rewrite this old crufty Ruby CLI in another language. And really just kind of fell in love with building developer tools. It's just been a big passion of mine, especially CLI things. And I've done quite a bit of open source stuff. I wrote a CLI framework for Node called Oclif, and then a lot of unsuccessful little tools here and there. But my most recent one, Mise, I started about 2 years ago, which people seem to really love, which is great to see.
Cool. So let's start out with Oclif, since that's the classic thing that you might be known for. So what is Oclif, and what were some of the guiding principles behind that project?
Yeah. So the goal with Oclif was to merge two CLIs in particular. Heroku is owned by Salesforce, and so Salesforce had their CLI, Heroku had theirs, and they wanted to sort of merge the two and also have both of them be independent CLIs at the same time. And both of these CLIs were developed with a very similar org structure that is common in large companies with a CLI, where you have a lot of different teams that maintain one small component of a CLI, a few commands here and there, that all kind of need to flow into this big CLI. And Oclif written in Node was a pretty solid fit for that, because just the way that Node dependencies work, each sort of module here can have its own set of dependencies. And each of those dependencies can be different versions. And so that model really worked well for, sort of large CLIs with hundreds of commands. I left the development of that close to a decade ago now. But I know it's still being developed. I know big companies are still picking it up. I think Shopify picked it up recently. Had I stayed on, I wanted to also make it really like the solution for small CLIs as well, because it is a little bit daunting for small CLIs. That's not what it was made for. But I think it could have been. I always wanted to have just like a single file example of just like here's a single file Oclif CLI. But that never came to fruition, but could have been.
Yeah, I always kind of think of Oclif as the Next.js of CLI frameworks, kind of, because there are a lot of small ones. Commander was around forever, and it was a good way to make a small CLI app. And I mean, it's obviously still being developed too, but things like that were just rely on chaining interfaces or whatever, they grow very messily. I think you have to have a very rigorous team to sort of maintain it.
The big problem with Node CLIs is the startup time. Because the way that you write a CLI, it's been a while since I've been in the Node space, so I don't know if other solutions have come around this, but normally you have you do a require of all the commands. And so if you've got a CLI that's tens of thousands of JavaScript files, then anytime you load anytime you run the CLI, it's got to go parse all that JavaScript. And so the thing that Oclif did was it would just load the command that it's about to run, right? And so that made it much faster, right? I mean, this is still Node, so you're looking at 100 milliseconds probably overhead no matter what you do. But at least it's only 100 milliseconds, even in pretty large code base.
Yeah, I think an article you wrote a very long time ago at this point, the 12 guiding principles of command line interface design. I've referenced back to that a lot. One thing I want to know though is you'd write a lot of CLIs still, but you don't use Node. Do you not use Oclif anymore for those CLIs?
I haven't used Oclif in a while, right? And really just because I haven't written a CLI on that scale in a long time. I still think it has good utility there, right? Because like most of my CLIs are in Rust now, but like that would not be a good choice for a lot of what people are using Oclif for, right? Because it's like I was saying, you might have a server team that's doing like Postgres and stuff, and like if they don't have a lot of Rust, if they don't have a lot of CLI experience, you need something that's pretty simple. And even though people complain about JavaScript a lot, I think any software engineer can write it, right? And if it's something they only need to do for 5-10% of their job, I think it's a good common denominator for a lot of developers.
So other than like startup time and potentially like this like composability and simplicity to like contribute to for large teams, what do you think are the really important like DX aspects to keep in mind when you're like building a CLI? Like what are your like fundamentals? It's like every time you start one, you're like, okay, these are the things that I want to keep in mind.
There's some basics, things you might expect, like using standard error and standard out correctly. One thing I'll say on that, because I think this is commonly misunderstood, standard error is not for errors. It's for any information that isn't part of the normal output, right? So, oftentimes that's warning and errors, but it might just be progress information. Anytime that you just need to have something go to the user, that's what it's there for. And so, I think that's one important one that's often misunderstood. And I think putting some thought into like what you name things. One philosophy I have is that command names should always be verbs and not nouns, and that I think tends to bring a consistent interface to the way things are built. Like for example, I'm sure we'll talk about ASDF, but like there's a command to change the global version of different tools, and the way you do that is ASDF global and then the name. Global's not a verb, right? Should be actually ASDF is changing this to set. So I think they realize that it is a mistake. So now it's ASDF set global, like -- global, something like that. And that makes a lot more sense. So, I think, the sort of name of the CLI, a verb, and then, the things it does.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There are some like CLIs that I've used that I feel like the noun is okay. So like GitHub, for example, so it's like hub PR, like doing something on a PR, like GitHub PR checkout or whatever. That feels like okay, but there's like a lot of top level categories.
Yeah, it's basically the last thing, right? So it's GitHub PR create. So that's good, right? And like with any rule, there are exceptions. Like Heroku logs, that just works. I don't think it should be Heroku logs list, Heroku logs view. Sometimes conciseness is just better. But yeah, I think as a general rule to start from, it should be, a tier could be fine. And actually when it's a tier, the middle stuff probably should be a noun because you're sort of describing some middle thing, whether that's pull requests or repositories. In the case of GitHub CLI, I think it's a good way to do it.
Cool. So let's start jumping into all the other projects that you've been working on. There's a lot for me to review when preparing for this episode. So the first one I'd like to talk about is Usage. Could you tell us a little more about that project and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, so Usage is, in a sentence, it's Swagger for CLIs. Right. It's mostly just a spec of it's written in a language that people probably had heard of called Cuddle. But it's just a configuration format. Maybe, it could have been JSON or YAML, but I went with Cuddle because reasons, and it was fun. But it just describes what a CLI looks like, what arguments it accepts, what flags it has. And I think probably most importantly is all the help. And so the idea is that once you've defined a CLI with this specification, then things like generating markdown documentation for help or having completion support can be much easier. And so the target market really for people using Usage isn't end users. It's really for CLI framework authors and vendors. Because if anybody out there has written completions in particular before, well, no, it's really hard. it is not a lot of fun. And, if you've got users that want it to work in Bash, in ZSH, in PowerShell, in, new shell, like you've got to repeat that really painful logic several times over. And so, sort of like how, language server protocols work in IDEs, it's similar ideas. You just need to make this relatively easy to dump spec. And then the usage, which runs as a runtime on the user's machine, can basically generate the completion code for you. And so it basically enables very powerful completion support without needing to code for each individual shell.
That's pretty awesome. I think this shows like your expertise in building CLIs, because this is an area that you won't get in for a while, but like when you start trying to like do this, it's like, it won't be too bad. I'll just like do, this for like Z shell. And it's like, oh wait, what about fish? What about whatever? The missions are really gnarly. They're like surprisingly gross.
They're horrible. Absolutely horrible. And part of it is just that I never want to write one again, right? So my hope is with usage, I could just, I've written it once and now I don't have to repeat that for every CLI I write.
Yeah, it's cool how it also does other outputs also, having man pages and markdown documentation, just so much simpler. And I like how like most of the time when I've written CLIs, it's been in Node and the documentation and all of that is a part of the definition. And it's like, they're so linked. Whereas this is so primitive that I can use it on just like scripts or just like whatever I want to describe more so, which I find very interesting.
Yeah. And we'll get into like how there's a lot of integration with Mise here. But like, being able to have just a single bash file that can, have this completion support, have doc generation around us was a big goal for me with writing that. And documentation is huge, right? I think, sort of getting back to your earlier question about like what makes a CLI good, I think like you got to have markdown, you got to have a good website that people can, command F and search and shows up well in SEO and all that stuff, I think is paramount, right? And so, I just released a newer CLI called Pitchfork, and I was able to just, once I dropped my little dumper thing in that created the usage spec, just like I just had all that. It was amazing. It was when I built that for me, it took me weeks to write all that.
It feels like the recipes for a new Oclif shaped thing are like there. There's like something about like this new like meta framework for CLIs, but it's not necessarily about like the direct implementation. So as much as it is like the infrastructure around it, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking very polyglot nowadays. I just don't really see myself as tied to any specific language. And so I really like things that are agnostic, right? That if I'm writing something in Go, it's just as easy to pick up these libraries and work with them.
Yeah, I've been doing a lot of code gen lately. I've got a project that's like written in Rust that uses this crate called schemas to generate JSON schema, and I'm like generating types from that. It's like once you get in the polyglot world, having some baseline configuration or whatever feels like it's kind of a superpower, because otherwise it's really hard to like maintain any sort of consistency.
We'd like to stop and thank our sponsor for this week, but we don't have one. So if you'd like to sponsor DevTools.fm, head over to devtools.fm/sponsor to apply. And if you want to find another way to support the podcast, head over to shop.devtools.fm, where you can buy some merch and rep the podcast. With that though, let's get back to the episode.
So before we move on to Mise, you had mentioned this project Pitchfork, which I wanted to talk a little bit about. So Pitchfork is new. It seems like you're like pretty actively working on it. So it's a CLI for launching Daemons, which seems really cool, seems really hard. And like my big question is like, okay, so, people might be familiar with like launchd or systemd or something. They might be using some OS primitive to like run their daemons. Like why Pitchfork, and what does that give people?
Yeah, so I probably have a success rate of like 1 to 20 when it comes to things. And so this is very experimental, but so Pitchfork is really about development daemons, right? So it's really not a replacement for like DevOps tools like systemd. The problem I wanted to solve is that I launched, let's say, my documentation web server for some CLI. Then like the way I do that is I open up a new terminal window and I minimize it. Then, next day I forget that's running and I go do that on a different CLI and the ports conflict. And, So I wanted a way really for my daemons to stop when I'm done working on something, was that is it's more the stopping that I needed. And so the way that Pitchfork works is once you enter a directory that has a sort of Pitchfork config, it'll launch whatever daemon you want. So say your Postgres server, your web service, your documentation, whatever daemon you want to run, and then when the last terminal session leaves that directory, it just will stop the daemon automatically. And so no more do I need a separate terminal window, and no more do I need to remember that I have these daemons running. I need to shut off.
That's pretty cool.
So let's move on to Mise. Mise is a much bigger project than these other two, where these are kind of tiny utilities. Mise seems to take a bigger part of your development workflow. So what is it, and why did you?
Yeah, so I think the tagline just really encapsulates it, right? It's the front end to your development environment, right? And so my goal with Mise is for it to be one polyglot interface that no matter what your product's written in, no matter how many languages ecosystems it has, you just have one common way to set it up, to manage it, to run it, and to maintain it. So running your DevOps commands and stuff would be at least started through Mise is the idea. And so there's really three sort of pillars of Mise that make it what it is. The first one is tools. And so Mise started out as a separate project actually called RTX. That was a direct just Rust clone of a tool called ASDF. And I guess maybe put a pin on that. But the other two pillars are environment variable management. So, similar to .env or .direnv, if you guys are familiar with those tools. But basically just a way that when you enter a directory, you have some environment variables set up. So whether that's Node.env or your AWS creds or things like that, whatever environment variables you need, they'll just be there when you enter the project. And the last one is tasks. So, a lot of people will use make to have a bunch of phony tasks so that, there's basically just a common, easy way that developers entering a project can run different things they need to do, whether that's install dependencies, build a project, or, sometimes deploy it, cut releases, or, things like that, run the tests, obviously. And so, Mise kind of brings all that together as one tool so that, imagine if you have Mise set up and a project uses it, the idea is all you need to do is go into that project, run Mise test, and that's going to run the test script. It'll install your dependencies, set up all your environment variables, and you don't even need to care or know what language it's written in, right? So, it basically just brings all this together.
Yeah, there's a lot there. This tool's doing a lot, and it's from the outside, it's maybe a little bit hard to grapple with the actual value. But so let's just start. We kind of put a pin in ASDF and talk about that a little bit. So this is my sort of introduction to Mise. Is I was a user of ASDF, but I never really liked it. So ASDF, just a tool to manage versions of things. So I would use it to manage the version of Node, the version of Python, these kinds of things. And ASDF team is great. They've done a lot of good work. There's a lot of great plugins that the ecosystem has built. But for me, I always bounced off the commands. You're talking about the verb. It was always, I could never remember the right commands. How do I install the right version of Node? It's did I install it in this directory? Is it global? And it was always a little bit clunky. But there's a lot of projects that'll use 3 or 4 different tools for managing different versions of things. So you got Rust up for managing Rust versions, or you got NVM or N or any number of things to manage Node versions and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that this is both hits that sweet spot of actually the commands are very sane and it does what you think. And hits just the rest of kind of what you need well from there. So tell us a little bit about the story of building a replacement for ASDF. What was your motivation there? And then what did that journey sort of look like getting to Mise to where it is today?
Yeah, I think developers automatically kind of see the value of ASDF when they first hear about it, right? Like I think developers are pretty comfortable with tools like NVM and PyEnv and things like that. But it's annoying to switch between them, right? Because they have slightly different characteristics, slightly different UX, right? Different file name structure for how they define versions of things. It's great to just have one file that you can just set things up. And so, I think that the ASDF was pretty, it's pretty much like the only tool that did this. It was like the only real popular sort of polyglot tool manager. But I took a closer look at it a couple of years ago, and I realized that like it was terribly slow. Like it was on my work computer that had a bunch of security software running. It was making my shell take like 2 seconds to load. And so, I kind of immediately was like, I bet if I rewrote this in another language, I could make it faster because, it's written in Bash. So every line of code in there is making a new separate process. So of course it's slow, right? Like if you just had a single process really written in anything, probably could be written in like Python or Node and be a lot faster. Anyhow, so I kind of set out to just, it's really an experiment. I wasn't really intending to ship it. I just kind of was playing around with it and trying to learn Rust and built a very basic, Rust version of ASDF. I posted it on the ASDF board. I was like, hey, I have this little thing I've been experimenting with, and people started using it immediately. Immediately, I had users, and there was definitely a need for just the same thing but faster. And so that was, it was very exciting for me. And then so I literally read every single ticket on their board, and people had a lot of really good ideas for how the DX could be improved. And so I literally just implemented their ideas, and so the sort of end result is that Mise ends up being very easy to use, but I can only take so much credit for that because I really just implemented the ideas that people have had over the 10 years ASDF's been around, and put that into a similar tool.
That's a fun way to prop up a new tool, is just by going through all of the bad feedback about the other tool. I noticed that so with Mise, you like install like different types of Node and Python and all that, but in some of the plugins it still references ASDF. What are the situations where I'd want to use like the Mise version versus the ASDF versions that are kicking around?
Ooh, I think I might need to step back and explain sort of how Mise works. So it started out really like the tools was just used ASDF. For different reasons, the way that tools are defined in ASDF is not great. And so about a year ago, I built this set of features in Mise called multiple backends. And so what Mise ended up turning into was that ASDF was one way you could install tools with Mise, but not the only one. And so you can also install tools with NPM, with PipX, with Cargo. And then a couple more generic tool managers called UBI and Aqua. And sort of each of these has their pros and cons, but ultimately for security reasons, for performance reasons, for stability reasons, there's often better ways to install tools with one backend versus the other. And so generally for a user, they don't need to know this. Mise has sort of it has a registry, and it's a curated list of all the hundreds of tools Mise has, and I selected what I think is the best for each one. And so it's different for each one, right? If I were to try to summarize it, I'd say that ASDF is the most capable as a backend, right? So the way ASDF plugins work is it's Bash code, right? And so that code could go out and it could compile the tool. It can fetch it from GitHub releases. It could run go install. It can really do anything. So like as a user, I don't know, it's complicated.
No, it makes sense. You have Bash, and Bash, you can do anything. So you end up having to trust like random people on the internet to do things on your computer, which is never a good idea, really.
No, and that's probably the biggest problem with ASDF, and I knew that going into this, that the way ASDF's model works is you have every tool you use has its own repository that is almost always just some random developer built this code that goes and fetches a tool, right? And that's very risky, right? Because if you've got 20 different plugins, you might be relying on all those 20 developers to not get hacked and ultimately have malicious code enter their plugin. And so, I've just sort of recently I put up a big post where this has effectively become a solved problem in Mise now. But basically, when you use Mise with the default set, you're either getting stuff directly from the vendor without a plugin, or in the few cases that I have to use a plugin, the plugin comes from a repository that I own, right? So you're still gonna have to trust me, sorry, but at least it's just one developer, right? And not one for every tool you're using.
Yeah, we had somebody on. We had Jordan Harband on a while back, and he was talking about like dependencies and like the chain of trust is like it's more about the people in your dependency chain than it is like the different packages or the different plugins that you rely on. So that is like a nice model, at least knowing that like you have one source of trust. I also learned about Aqua through Mise. So Aqua is like they have a CLI tool that is kind of like Mise in that it like does tool management, but it's like very focused on security. And I don't think it has like a lot of the other features that Mise brings. But their registry is like really great. It's like also a really good source of like high quality tooling that's like really focused on, their extensions are focused on security. So that's also like a great source. And I do appreciate that Mise like supports these multiple backends. It like, gives me a lot of hope for the future of the project, just being able to like, change these in and out. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, and so Mise, Aqua is the preferred backend for Mise. And so if there's an Aqua, Aqua is just it's a YAML manifest for each tool. And if that exists, I will always use it pretty much. And Aqua has some more advanced security features too that it supports, like cosign and salsa verification that go beyond just making sure that this tarball came from this GitHub release of this username repo. Like salsa, for example, it can the dream there is like you can look at a single git commit from when that tool was tagged, and you can verify that like even the whole build chain and all the dependencies that it pulled in was all kosher. And so our industry is still young when it comes to this. Not that many tools support this, but I part of the problem there is tools like Mise, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, if the developer's not installing stuff with some of these I think what will eventually be essential security features in place, there's no reason for the vendor to publish it, right? So I think the world looks bright, and kudos to Aqua for at least starting us down the road by having a registry that tools like Mise can rely on.
Cool. Let's delve into some of the other parts of these. One thing that stood out to me a lot was tasks. Coming from the Node world, I love to rely on my scripts in my package JSON, and tasks give me a very similar feel. And Mise as a tool almost feels like a package JSON for everything. So what are tasks and how can I use them?
It's exactly what it is, right? I love NPM run tests. It's just, any Node developer loves just being able to jump in a project and run this, these conventional sort of commands that are used with pretty much all Node projects, right? So yeah, I mean that's my goal. Is I want to bring that experience to the Polyglot world, where you can have that same experience when you jump into Python projects, jump into Go projects, right? And so yeah, I mean that's the idea, right? Is to have that common interface. And I think that like package.json tasks, for example, they're very limited, right? There's not a lot of functionality there. And a lot of times there's some boilerplate, right? Like maybe it just runs a bash script. And so with Mise, I try to think about like all the different ways people want to define tasks, right? Sometimes that is just a bash script, right? And so in Mise, that step is unnecessary, right? If you just sort of put your files in the right place, Mise will just pick it up and it'll know that script is a task and it'll present it as such to the user. So you can generate your task documentation and you can have dependencies and stuff. It's all wired up as if it was in, the configuration file. But then also sometimes, having your tasks in TOML is good too. Sometimes you just have, 5 or 6 tasks that are all just one line of code. And so that can all just live there as well.
Yeah, it's also an improvement because you can't do comments in package JSON. So I end up with this enormous block of scripts where I can't tell anybody what they're for at all. And the way you can now mix Mise with usage and get full featured docs for your script section is super, super nice.
And the completions is the thing I get most excited about. So with Mise tasks, you can very easily have a completion for, let's say you have a dash username flag on a task. You can define another task that, all it needs to do is print to standard out a bunch of usernames. So maybe that's going into some API or something. It's very easy to do. And as long as completions are working in Mise normally, that just all gets wired up. And so you type Mise run, name of task, dash username, tab, boom, there's your users.
Yeah, it's incredible. And so the package.json has a lot of drawbacks. So the comment thing I think is true. Oftentimes people install a separate dependency to be able to run tasks in parallel, for example. And so Mise has parallel tasks sort of out of the box. You have dependencies. So you can do pre and post sort of in a package.json, but it's kind of gross. But you can actually do dependencies. I love the fact that you can wait on something to complete. If something else is running, you don't actually have to say, oh, I want you to run this. But if it's running, I just want to wait until it's done. That's super powerful. There's so much. The tasks are so rich. And I think when I really got the value, it's I had a project where I had installed Wrangler, the CLI tool for Cloudflare, as a dependency of the project because I needed it to build. But ideally, I wouldn't install it as a dependency. Hopefully, it'd be globally available. So I used the npm backend for Mise to install the thing, and you just Mise run build, and it runs the build script and it makes sure that Wrangler is installed, does all the stuff. And I was this is really powerful in a lot of ways, especially combining the two between managing the dependencies and installing things. And then I think a project that I was mentioning earlier that I was doing that's a Rust project that uses a bunch of other languages. So it's Rust, it's Python, and it's Dino, and it'll install all of them. It'll set them up, and I have I can do Mise run gen, and it'll do run gen Python, run gen Dino, and make sure everything is set up correctly. And typically it's a hard task. Dino doesn't really have a blessed version manager, and I don't know. There's so much stuff, and it's the fact that I have all of that in one file is that's super powerful. And it's a pretty incredible DX. So one of the other things that is a pretty cool feature is you have hooks that just came out of experimental. So it's you can add a hook for when you enter the directory or leave the directory. So what was sort of the motivation and inspiration for hooks? We kind of talked about Pitchfork earlier. It sounds like a similar thing.
Frankly, hooks is an exhaust valve, so I don't have to implement things. So basically, as people have started to use Mise for very advanced things, people started to ask for crazy features that I just am not going to be able to develop, right? And so, hooks was an attempt for me to figure out, okay, I'm not going to be able to develop all these things. Let's, as an example, there's a user that wanted the ability to have one password generate a bunch of secret environment variables that then could enter in the project. I'm I don't want to go out and build that integration, right? So hooks are a way that I could build, a place that they could define that themselves, right? So now this user can have an enter hook that when they enter the directory, it'll call one password, generate the secrets file, and then Mise can import that. Another one was that a user wanted to have, so Mise has support for automatically creating and activating Python virtual env, and they wanted that virtual env to come with some set of packages that, for whatever reason, they don't want to have in their requirements.txt. And so, once again, this gives them that ability, right? Because they could just run pip install, UV install, whatever. And so, I think it does a great job at that because these things are not hard to write, but ultimately it just, solves those, or it gives the user the ability to solve those advanced use cases without Mise needing to get more complicated than it is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one last feature to cover in Mise is environment variables. And we can talk about secrets as well. So this is like, .env, great tool, really powerful, have a .env file and like automatically, import those when you start up your program. It is another dependency. It's a very load-bearing dependency. Anything that reads your environment variables is kind of, but like Mise has a lot of functionality to help manage environment variables. So would you like to talk through a little bit of those and sort of how you think about environment variables, and maybe if you have like any thoughts on like having a good like secure setup and like any tips that you build into Mise for that would be cool.
Yeah, it's funny the way you bitch that is actually more the reason it exists. So this started because it was easy. Because when I built the tool management stuff for Mise, some tools, Java, for example, needs to set the Java home environment variable. And so it was trivial for me to just allow the user to define any arbitrary environment variables they want. So kind of initially it was just kind of I just threw it in because it was simple. But I found myself, and a lot of users mentioned that they were able to not use, Durenv or other similar tools. And it was just convenient to they've already got Mise. And so, now they could just put this in one place and it's convenient. So that was kind of the case for a long time. But, as people used it more and as Mise grew, people, had identified more use cases that were pretty compelling. Python VM was a big one. Python users love that they don't need to type source.vm/whatever to, activate their virtual env when they enter a project. They can just have it happen automatically. Another one was secrets management. So like having this .m file, and this, I guess I'm getting to your question about, secure practice and stuff, but it's not good to have your AWS creds just sitting in a file.
Really?
Actually, fun fact: when I worked at Heroku, I actually sent the prod creds to the AWS S3 bucket in the npm package, and it was sitting there for a while until we got a bug report from somebody that because I just had the file sitting there, and the way npm publish works is it just package it right up and send the .m file out. So, it's just not good to have those files in plain text. And so Mise will use a tool called SOPs and Age, which allow you to encrypt those, right? And so, if that ever happens and those files end up out there, well, they're encrypted. So nobody can get to them.
Sweet. So now looking towards the future, you guys have a roadmap. It seems to have a lot of stuff on there. One thing that piqued my interest was the GUI TUI support. So what do you have planned for 2025? And is it going to involve a website?
It's going to be a lot of refining. There's some things that are still marked as experimental. Like Mise has like a lock file that it needs to bake a little more. It needs some more design work and needs some bugs ironed out. Let me think. Yeah, so I think like getting most things out of experimentals is a big goal of mine. Some of the supply chain stuff I mentioned earlier, and that's a little less on me and Mise and more on the tools that it relies on. Like I want to build some features into Mise that make it obvious when things like salsa and cosine are being used, so developers are aware, and then presumably can prod the tool vendors a little bit to start adopting these things. I think it would be really good to have. And then also just improving the Oclif registry, because I'm sure that there are many vendors out there that are doing this stuff, but we just haven't wired it up yet. So there's a lot of that. I want to really improve the security across the board with how Mise works and the tools it relies on. There's been some pretty small TUI things in Mise already. Like for example, if you type Mise run with no arguments, it'll show you a little FZF style selector, so you can type in a task to run. Similar thing with Mise Use, which is where you install tools into Mise. So you can search for, how is it Node? Is it Node.js? Is it, Go? Is it Golang? You sort of sort out those before you try it and run it. So I want to identify places like that because definitely CLIs can. There are definitely cases where having a interactive element in a CLI is very handy. I'm not working on it, but Hugues Verlin is working on a VS Code plugin for me. He's really adding a lot of features to it. But I will probably support that by adding more JSON support into Mise, making it more programmable so that can do more. I think that's pretty exciting. And there's also like IntelliJ IDE extensions, stuff like that. So I don't know if I'll be working on that, but definitely people are quite interested in that. They want those things, and so yeah, I think we'll see a lot more of that in 2025.
That's incredibly exciting. I just want to say, thanks for all your work on this. Again, it's definitely in the last several months, it's my favorite tool that I've picked up. It's really changed a lot of my workflows. It's been excellent. So you've done a great job.
It's great to hear.
Well, that wraps up our questions. Thanks for coming on, Jeff. I haven't tried out Mise yet, but I'm definitely going to try it out when I set up my next new computer. So thanks for coming on, and thanks for building such a cool tool.